Scotland, 1297, a land torn apart by English occupation, a nation bleeding under the iron fist of Edward I, known to history as the Hammer of the Scots. The fields were soaked with the blood of rebellion, the gallows creaked with the weight of patriots, and the people lived in terror of a king who believed Scotland was his by divine right. But among the shadows of resistance, one name began to whisper through the glens and valleys like a prayer of vengeance: William Wallace. What this man did at Stirling Bridge wasn't just a victory, it was a message written in blood, carved into flesh, and designed to haunt the nightmares of every English lord who dared set foot on Scottish soil. What you're about to hear is not the sanitized version taught in classrooms. This is the brutal, visceral truth that history tried to bury. The year 1297 marked one of the darkest chapters in Scotland's struggle for independence. King Edward I of England had systematically dismantled Scottish sovereignty following the disputed succession after King Alexander III's death in 1286. Edward, a ruthless military strategist and iron-willed monarch, saw Scotland not as a separate kingdom, but as a rebellious northern province that needed to be crushed into submission. His methods were calculated and merciless. He stripped Scottish nobles of their lands, installed English administrators to collect punitive taxes, and garrisoned English troops throughout the country to enforce his will. The Scottish people were subjected to humiliating laws, forced to quarter English soldiers in their homes, and watched helplessly as their resources were extracted to fund Edward's wars in France and Wales. By the spring of 1297, the situation had become unbearable. English officials governed with impunity, using violence and intimidation to maintain control. Among these officials, one man stood out as particularly hated: Hugh Cressingham, Edward's treasurer in Scotland. Cressingham was a corpulent, arrogant clergyman who took sadistic pleasure in his role as chief tax collector. He squeezed the Scottish people mercilessly, confiscating grain, livestock, and whatever wealth he could extract to fill Edward's coffers. Contemporary Scottish chroniclers described him as greedy beyond measure, a man who grew fat on Scottish suffering while the people starved. He travelled with armed guards, lived in luxury confiscated from Scottish nobles, and openly mocked the idea that Scotland would ever be free again. To the Scottish people, Cressingham wasn't just an administrator. He was the living embodiment of everything they had come to hate about English rule. Against this backdrop of oppression and despair, William Wallace emerged. But who was this man who would become Scotland's most legendary rebel? Wallace was not a great nobleman or a knight of high standing. He was a minor landowner, a member of the lower nobility with no significant political power or military resources. Historical records tell us frustratingly little about his early life. We know he was born around 1270, possibly in Elderslie in Renfrewshire, or perhaps in Ellerslie in Ayrshire. His father was likely Malcolm Wallace, a small landholder who owed allegiance to James Stewart, the High Steward of Scotland. What transformed this obscure figure into a revolutionary leader remains partially shrouded in mystery, though later accounts, including the epic poem by Blind Harry, written nearly 2 centuries later, suggest that personal tragedy played a role. Whether his wife was murdered by English soldiers, as legend claims, or whether other injustices drove him to action, one fact is undeniable. By May 1297, William Wallace had killed the English sheriff of Lanark and ignited a flame of rebellion that would consume Scotland. Wallace's early actions were audacious and brutal. After killing Sheriff William Heselrigg in Lanark, he didn't flee or hide. Instead, he gathered followers and began systematically attacking English positions throughout southern Scotland. His methods were unconventional, born not from formal military training, but from desperation and cunning. He avoided pitched battles where English heavy cavalry and trained men-at-arms held the advantage. Instead, he used ambush, surprise, and intimate knowledge of the Scottish terrain to strike at vulnerable targets. His forces attacked supply convoys, burned English-held castles, and assassinated officials. Each success brought more recruits to his banner. Dispossessed farmers, younger sons of nobles with nothing to lose, outlaws, and men driven by sheer hatred of the occupation flocked to join him. By summer 1297, Wallace commanded a force of several thousand men, though most were poorly equipped and untrained in formal warfare. What they lacked in armor and discipline, they compensated for with rage and desperation. The Scottish resistance in 1297 was not limited to Wallace alone. Throughout the country, nobles and commoners alike had begun to resist English rule. In the north, Andrew de Moray, a young nobleman, had escaped from English custody and raised rebellion in the Highlands. De Moray was everything Wallace wasn't: well-born, educated, trained in warfare, and connected to Scotland's traditional power structures. Yet both men recognized that divided, they would fail. In an unusual alliance that bridged class divides, Wallace and de Moray joined forces in August 1297. Their combined army represented something unprecedented in medieval Scottish warfare, a force that united commoners and nobles, lowlanders and highlanders, behind a single cause. They positioned themselves near Stirling, where they knew the English would have to come. Stirling Castle controlled the main route into the Scottish Highlands, and its strategic importance made it an inevitable battleground. King Edward, occupied with military campaigns in Flanders, delegated the suppression of the Scottish rebellion to his commanders in the north. The Earl of Surrey, John de Warenne, was appointed to lead the English response. Surrey was an experienced but aging commander, a veteran of Edward's Welsh campaigns who had grown comfortable in his position of authority. Alongside him marched Hugh Cressingham, whose position as treasurer gave him authority over the campaign's finances. Cressingham's presence in the army was partly practical. Edward wanted his treasurer to personally oversee the expenditure of funds, but it was also symbolic. Cressingham's participation was meant to demonstrate English dominance, to show that even a fat, unarmed clergyman could march safely through rebellious Scotland under the protection of English arms. The irony of this decision would soon become apparent in the most horrific way possible. The English army that marched north in September 1297 was formidable by any standard. Contemporary sources vary on its exact size, but it likely numbered between 8,000 and 10,000 men, including heavy cavalry, professional men-at-arms and Welsh archers. These were not raw recruits, but experienced soldiers who had fought in Edward's continental wars. Their equipment was the best medieval warfare could provide: horses bred for battle, armor of mail and plate, shields, lances, swords, and the fearsome English longbow. They marched with supreme confidence, expecting the Scottish rebels to either flee at their approach or be quickly crushed in battle. Medieval chronicles record that Cressingham was particularly eager to bring the rebels to battle, arguing against any delay or negotiation. He wanted a quick, decisive victory that would restore English authority and allow him to return to collecting taxes. This arrogance would prove fatal not just for Cressingham personally, but for thousands of English soldiers who trusted in the invincibility of their arms. The landscape around Stirling in September 1297 was crucial to everything that followed. The area was dominated by Stirling Castle, perched on a volcanic crag that commanded views for miles in every direction. Below the castle, the River Forth meandered through flat, marshy ground before narrowing at a crucial crossing point, a wooden bridge barely wide enough for two horsemen to ride abreast. This bridge was the only practical way for a large army to cross the river and advance northward into the Highlands. The alternative was to ford the river several miles downstream, but this would require a lengthy detour through difficult terrain. The ground on the north side of the bridge was particularly treacherous, flat floodplain that turned to marsh with any rain, crisscrossed by streams and bogs that could swallow a man or horse. It was exactly the kind of terrain that medieval heavy cavalry dreaded, where their weight and armor became liabilities rather than advantages. Wallace and de Moray had arrived at Stirling days before the English army. Their scouts had surveyed the ground with the eye of men who knew they couldn't win a conventional battle. What they saw was an opportunity. The bridge created a natural choke point, and the marshy ground on the north side would prevent the English from deploying their forces effectively once they crossed. The Scottish commanders positioned their army on the slopes of Abbey Craig, a hill that overlooked the bridge from the north. From this vantage point, they could watch the English preparations and time their attack perfectly. They didn't have to defeat the entire English army. They only needed to destroy the portion that crossed the bridge before reinforcements could arrive. It was a plan born of desperation, but executed with brilliant tactical awareness. The Scots would use the terrain as a weapon, turning the English army's strengths into fatal weaknesses. When Surrey's army arrived on the south bank of the Forth on September 10th, the English commanders faced an immediate decision. The bridge was clearly a dangerous crossing point, and Scottish forces were visible on the heights beyond. Some of Surrey's subordinates, including a Scottish knight named Richard Lundy, who was fighting for the English, urged caution. Lundy reportedly offered to lead a force to a ford 2 miles upstream, where they could cross safely and outflank the Scottish position. But this would take time, and time meant money. Cressingham, ever focused on the cost of maintaining an army in the field, argued vehemently for an immediate assault across the bridge. He allegedly said that there was no point in prolonging the campaign and wasting the king's revenues when the rebels could be crushed in a single morning. Surrey, whether convinced by Cressingham's arguments or simply weary of debate, agreed to force the crossing. The decision to cross at Stirling Bridge has been analysed by military historians for centuries as one of the most catastrophic tactical blunders of medieval warfare. In their defence, the English commanders may have believed that the mere sight of their armoured cavalry would cause the Scottish rebels to flee, as had happened in previous encounters. Medieval warfare often hinged on morale, and poorly equipped rebels frequently broke and ran when faced with charging knights. But Wallace and de Moray were not typical rebel leaders, and their forces, while outmatched in equipment, were fighting for their homes with nothing left to lose. The English also may have underestimated their opponents due to simple prejudice. To men like Cressingham, the Scots were barbarous northerners, incapable of sophisticated military tactics. The idea that these rebels might have planned a trap simply didn't fit with the English perception of their enemies. On the morning of September 11th, the English began their crossing. The bridge could only accommodate 2 or 3 men abreast, so the crossing was painfully slow. First came the vanguard of cavalry, proud knights in full armour mounted on war horses. Behind them came men-at-arms on foot, carrying spears and shields. The process took hours. Imagine the sound. Thousands of hoofbeats on wooden planks, the creak of armour, the shouted orders of commanders trying to maintain formation in such confined space. The Scottish forces on Abbey Craig remained motionless, making no move to contest the crossing. This should have alarmed the English commanders, but it seems to have had the opposite effect. The lack of resistance was interpreted as evidence that the Scots were paralysed by fear, that they would break and run once enough English troops had crossed. Cressingham himself crossed with the advance forces, his bulky frame mounted on a war horse, perhaps enjoying what he thought would be his triumphant moment. Contemporary accounts suggest he was wearing armour, unusual for a clergyman, though whether it was full battle armour or a lighter protection is unclear. Around him crossed some of the finest troops in Edward's army. Experienced knights who had fought in France and Wales, hardened soldiers who formed the core of English military power. They deployed on the north bank in the cramped space between the bridge and the rising ground, trying to form into battle lines despite the constricted terrain and marshy ground that sucked at their horses' hooves. Behind them, more troops continued to file across the narrow bridge, the army splitting itself in half with the river between them. Wallace and de Moray waited with inhuman patience. They let more and more English troops cross, allowing them to crowd onto the north bank, where the marshy ground would prevent manoeuvre. The Scottish commanders needed enough English troops across to make the attack worthwhile, but not so many that they couldn't be overwhelmed. They were gambling everything on perfect timing. Medieval chroniclers, writing with the benefit of hindsight, described Wallace watching the crossing like a hunter watching prey walk into a trap. He allegedly told his men to wait until the English forces were at their most vulnerable, split by the river, with neither half able to support the other. When approximately half the English army had crossed, roughly 4,000 to 5,000 men crowded onto the marshy ground with their backs to the river, Wallace gave the signal. The Scottish attack came like an avalanche. Thousands of Scots charged down from Abbey Craig with terrifying speed, screaming their war cries, their weapons raised. But they didn't charge directly at the English forces. The main thrust of the Scottish attack was aimed at the bridge itself. Wallace had positioned a force specifically to cut off the English troops on the north bank from their comrades on the south. Scottish soldiers, many armed with axes and spears, swarmed onto the bridge and began hacking at its wooden supports while holding off any English troops trying to cross. Within minutes, the bridge became impassable. Some Scots may have even destroyed sections of it, though accounts vary. What is certain is that the English army was now physically divided, with thousands of their best troops trapped on the north bank, with no means of escape except to swim the deep, fast-flowing Forth or fight their way through the Scottish forces. The trapped English forces tried desperately to form defensive lines, but the terrain made it impossible. The marshy ground that had been merely inconvenient during the crossing now became a death sentence. Heavy cavalry couldn't charge effectively through mud that came up to their horses' bellies. Knights in full armor found their horses foundering, some animals actually sinking into the marsh and having to be abandoned. The weight of armor that was meant to protect them now made them slow and clumsy. Infantry tried to form shield walls, but they were constantly disrupted by the uneven ground and the relentless Scottish assault from multiple directions. The English forces on the south bank could only watch in horror as their comrades were systematically destroyed less than 100 yards away across the river. The Scottish fighting style at Stirling Bridge was brutal and practical. Wallace's men were armed primarily with long spears, axes and swords. They couldn't match the English in armor or horsemanship, but in close quarters combat on terrible ground, these advantages evaporated. Scottish spearmen worked in groups, surrounding English knights and pulling them from their horses. Once a knight was on the ground, his armor became a liability. The joints in plate armor, designed to allow movement, were also weak points. Scottish soldiers drove daggers through gaps in armor at the armpit, groin and neck. They used axes to dent helmets and stun opponents before finishing them with knife thrusts. The sound must have been nightmarish. The screams of dying men and horses, the clash of metal on metal, the wet sucking sound of bodies falling into mud, the shouted Gaelic war cries of the Scots mixed with the desperate cries in Norman French and English. Hugh Cressingham, the hated treasurer, was among those trapped on the north bank. As a non-combatant clergyman, he was likely near the rear of the English formation, but the Scottish assault was so total that nowhere on that blood-soaked ground was safe. Accounts of Cressingham's death vary, but all agree on the essential facts. He was pulled from his horse, probably by Scottish spearmen, working together to bring down the mounted rider. Once on the ground, with Scottish soldiers swarming around him, he would have been quickly killed. Some chronicles suggest he tried to surrender, offering ransom as was customary for prisoners of rank. But the Scots were not interested in ransom. They were interested in revenge. Cressingham's death was not quick or clean. He was butchered on the battlefield, hacked apart by men who had suffered under his taxation and cruelty for years. But death was not the end of Cressingham's ordeal. What happened next is documented in multiple medieval chronicles and represents one of the most shocking acts in medieval warfare. After the battle, as Scottish soldiers moved through the killing ground, stripping the dead of armor and valuables, Cressingham's corpse was singled out for special treatment. His body was skinned, not partially, but completely. The skin was carefully removed from the corpse in the way a hunter would skin a deer. This was not random mutilation born of battle frenzy. It was deliberate, carried out with skill that suggests someone with experience in flaying animals. The flaying of Cressingham's body would have taken time and concentration, performed after the fighting had ended, when the Scots had leisure to exact their revenge on the corpse of the man who had symbolized English oppression. The reasons for this horrific act were multi-layered. On one level, it was pure revenge. Cressingham had made himself personally hated through his role as tax collector and his open contempt for the Scottish people. His death alone wasn't enough to satisfy the rage of men who had seen their families starve while Cressingham grew fat on confiscated wealth. The flaying was a way to dishonor him beyond death, to deny him even the dignity of an intact corpse for Christian burial. But it was also a political statement. By flaying the body of such a high-ranking English official, Wallace was sending a message that couldn't be misunderstood. The English were not invincible. Even their officials, protected by armor and armies, could be killed and desecrated. The act was designed to inspire terror in other English administrators and hope in Scots still living under occupation. What was done with Cressingham's skin is the subject of some of history's most disturbing legends. The most widely repeated account comes from later Scottish chronicles, which claim that Wallace had strips of Cressingham's skin made into practical items. Some sources specify that Wallace had a sword belt made from the treasurer's skin, which he wore as a macabre trophy. Other accounts mention that pieces were distributed among Scottish leaders or sent to various towns as proof of the English defeat. How much of this is literal truth and how much is embellishment added by later chroniclers is impossible to determine with certainty. What we do know from English administrative records is that Cressingham's body was not recovered intact. English documents from the period reference Cressingham's death at Stirling and note that his body was abused by the Scots, language that medieval writers used to describe corpse desecration. The flaying of Cressingham's body must be understood in the context of medieval warfare and justice. The Middle Ages were a time of extreme violence by modern standards. Public executions were common and deliberately gruesome, designed to serve as deterrents. Traitors were hanged, drawn and quartered. Criminals were broken on the wheel, burned alive, or subjected to other tortures before execution. In warfare, the mistreatment of enemy dead was not unknown, though usually limited to displaying severed heads or mutilating bodies to prevent their recognition. But flaying was exceptional, even by medieval standards. It was a punishment usually reserved for the worst criminals or enemies, documented in some biblical and classical sources, but rarely in medieval European warfare. For Wallace to order or allow this act demonstrates the depth of Scottish hatred for the occupation and the deliberate choice to fight a total war without the usual medieval conventions limiting violence. The propaganda value of Cressingham's flaying, from Wallace's perspective, was immense. News of the desecration spread rapidly throughout Scotland and England. For Scots still under English occupation, it was proof that resistance was possible, that the English could be beaten and humiliated. It helped Wallace recruit more followers and probably encouraged other rebellions throughout Scotland. For the English, the news was devastating. The mere fact that a high royal official had been killed in battle was bad enough, but the knowledge that his body had been flayed and made into trophies created a deep psychological impact. It made English administrators fearful for their own safety and demonstrated that service in Scotland was not a comfortable posting, but a genuinely dangerous assignment. The immediate aftermath of the Scottish charge was complete chaos on the north bank of the Forth. Trapped English soldiers realized they faced annihilation. Some tried to fight their way back to the bridge, only to find it blocked or destroyed. Others attempted to swim the river in full armor, a decision that was almost always fatal. The River Forth at Stirling is deep and fast-flowing, with a strong current that would sweep away even a strong swimmer unencumbered by armor. A knight in full mail and plate armor, weighing perhaps 60 or 70 pounds, simply sank like a stone. Chronicles record that bodies in armor could be seen on the riverbed for years afterward. Some desperate soldiers tried to remove their armor before entering the water, but this left them vulnerable to Scottish arrows and spears while they struggled with buckles and straps. The English forces on the south bank of the river watched the destruction of their comrades with mounting horror and fury. The Earl of Surrey, commanding from the south bank, ordered troops to attempt to reinforce the north bank, but with the bridge destroyed or blocked, there was no way to get significant forces across quickly. Some English soldiers may have attempted to cross at fording points upstream or downstream, but by the time they could reach the battlefield, the fight was over. Surrey reportedly attempted to organize Welsh archers to shoot across the river at the Scots, but the range was too great for effective shooting, and friendly fire was a serious risk, with English troops still alive among the Scottish forces. The English command structure, so confident hours earlier, collapsed into confusion and recrimination. Officers blamed each other for the disaster. Some sources suggest Surrey himself was in tears, watching his army being destroyed. The slaughter on the north bank continued for hours. Medieval battle was exhausting work. Men could only fight intensely for minutes at a time before needing rest, and the close quarters combat at Stirling Bridge was especially draining. The Scots didn't simply kill all the English soldiers in a single continuous assault. Instead, the battle became a series of smaller fights scattered across the marshy ground, as English soldiers formed small defensive groups and were systematically hunted down and killed. Some English troops attempted to surrender, but quarters was rarely given. The Scots were fighting a war of national survival against an occupying power, and the medieval laws of war that might have protected noble prisoners didn't extend to common soldiers. More importantly, Wallace and his men knew that any mercy shown today would not be reciprocated if the situations were reversed. English policy towards Scottish rebels was execution, and everyone present knew it. As the day wore on and English resistance on the north bank collapsed, the scale of the disaster became clear. The English had lost thousands of men, including many knights and experienced soldiers who formed the core of their military power in Scotland. The exact casualty figures are disputed among sources. Some Scottish chronicles claim 10,000 English dead, which is almost certainly an exaggeration. More conservative modern estimates suggest 2,000 to 3,000 English casualties. Though even this lower figure represents a catastrophic defeat, the Scottish casualties were comparatively light, perhaps in the hundreds. Wallace and de Moray had achieved what seemed impossible, a decisive battlefield victory against a much larger, better-equipped English army. The death toll included not just common soldiers, but numerous nobles and knights. The medieval social hierarchy meant that the loss of these men was particularly significant. Knights were expensive to train and equip, representing years of investment in military education and equipment. Their deaths couldn't be quickly replaced. Moreover, many of these men were landholders who commanded their own retinues, so their deaths disrupted the entire English feudal military structure in Scotland. The death of Hugh Cressingham, while symbolically important, was also a practical blow. He was Edward's chief financial administrator in Scotland, responsible for collecting the revenues that funded the occupation. His death meant Edward would need to replace him, and finding a competent official willing to take such a dangerous posting would prove difficult. Survivors among the English forces told harrowing tales of the battle. Those who managed to swim the Forth or escape downstream spoke of the terror of being hunted through the marsh by Scottish spearmen, of watching comrades drown in the river or be pulled from their horses and butchered. They described how the ground itself seemed to betray them, horses and men alike foundering in mud, while the Scots, fighting on foot and familiar with the terrain, moved freely. English survivors also brought back the news about Cressingham, about what had been done to his body. These accounts, spreading through England, created a portrait of William Wallace as something almost demonic. A rebel leader who didn't just defeat English armies, but desecrated their dead in ways that violated every norm of civilized warfare. The English retreat from Stirling was nearly as chaotic as the battle itself. Surrey, his army shattered and demoralized, ordered an immediate withdrawal south. The retreat was hasty and poorly organized. Supply wagons were abandoned. Some sources suggest the English fled so rapidly that they didn't even stop in the towns they passed through, fearing Scottish pursuit. The Earl of Surrey himself reportedly rode so hard in his retreat that his horse died under him, and he had to commandeer another to continue his flight. This was not an organized military withdrawal, but a rout, a panicked flight by an army that had lost all confidence in its commanders and its ability to fight. The English didn't stop until they reached the fortifications of Berwick, near the English border, leaving all of central Scotland undefended. Wallace and de Moray didn't immediately pursue the retreating English army south. Their forces, while victorious, were exhausted from the battle and still consisted mostly of infantry who couldn't match the speed of a cavalry retreat. Moreover, the Scottish commanders had more immediate concerns. Stirling Castle still held an English garrison, and while it was now isolated, it remained a fortified position. The Scots also needed to secure their victory by ensuring no English reinforcements could counterattack quickly. In the days following the battle, Wallace and de Moray consolidated their control over central Scotland, gathering supplies from the battlefield and recruiting more men to their banner. The success at Stirling Bridge transformed them from rebel leaders into commanders of a national army. Scots who had remained neutral or reluctant to join the rebellion now flocked to join what appeared to be a winning cause. The news of the English defeat at Stirling Bridge reached King Edward in Flanders, where he was campaigning against the French. According to contemporary chronicles, Edward's reaction was one of fury mixed with disbelief. The hammer of the Scots, who had crushed Scottish resistance multiple times in previous years, could not comprehend how his army had been defeated by what he considered a rabble of peasant rebels. Edward immediately began preparations to return to England and personally lead an army north to crush the rebellion. But the campaign season was already late in the year, and winter made major military operations impossible. Wallace and the Scots had won not just a battle, but precious time to consolidate their position. In the aftermath of Stirling Bridge, William Wallace's reputation transformed dramatically. Before the battle, he had been one of several rebel leaders, known mainly in southwest Scotland. After Stirling Bridge, he became a national hero and the de facto military commander of Scotland's resistance. The Scottish nobility, many of whom had remained neutral or even sided with the English out of pragmatism, now had to reconsider their positions. A man of relatively low birth had accomplished what great earls and lords had failed to do. He had defeated an English army in open battle. This created both opportunities and tensions. Wallace was knighted and appointed Guardian of Scotland, ruling in the name of the exiled King John Balliol. But his rise also created jealousy among the nobility, who resented being subordinate to a man they considered their social inferior. The fate of Andrew de Moray, Wallace's co-commander at Stirling Bridge, is one of history's tragedies. During the battle, de Moray was wounded, probably by an arrow or spear thrust. The wound didn't immediately appear fatal, and he participated in the victory celebrations and the initial governance of freed Scotland. But infection set in, as it often did with medieval battlefield wounds. By November 1297, less than 2 months after the battle, Andrew de Moray was dead. His death meant that Wallace lost his most important ally, the man who had given the rebellion legitimacy in the eyes of the Scottish nobility. It also meant that later historians would often credit Wallace alone for the victory at Stirling Bridge, obscuring de Moray's crucial role in the campaign. Modern historians have worked to restore de Moray's reputation, recognizing that Stirling Bridge was a joint achievement. In the months following Stirling Bridge, Wallace led Scottish forces in raids deep into northern England. This was partly military strategy, keeping the English off balance and unable to prepare a counterattack, but it was also economic warfare and revenge. Scottish forces burned English towns, seized supplies and livestock, and extracted tribute from communities that paid to avoid destruction. The raids were brutal, matching the harshness of English occupation in Scotland. Chronicles from northern English towns describe Scottish soldiers as savage raiders who spared neither churches nor civilians. Wallace was demonstrating that the war could be brought to England itself, that English civilians could suffer the same fear and destruction that Scots had endured. These raids served multiple purposes. They weakened England economically, boosted Scottish morale, and helped feed Wallace's army through plunder. The winter of 1297-1298 saw Wallace attempting to govern Scotland and prepare for the English counterattack he knew was coming. This proved almost as difficult as the military campaign. Scotland's economy had been devastated by years of war. Crops had been destroyed, livestock killed or stolen, towns burned. Wallace needed to raise and maintain an army, but the country had limited resources to support military forces. He also faced political challenges. The Scottish nobility, while outwardly supporting him, often maneuvered for their own advantage. Some nobles who had fought for the English sought to switch sides and have their lands restored, creating complex negotiations. Wallace, as guardian, had to mediate disputes, administer justice, and maintain the fragile coalition of interests that held the resistance together. His lack of high birth and political experience made these tasks even more difficult. Edward I's return to England in March 1298 marked the beginning of the end for Wallace's military success. Edward was perhaps the most formidable military leader of his generation, a king who had conquered Wales and built a network of castles to hold it down. He brought to the Scottish campaign both vast resources and personal determination to crush the rebellion. Edward assembled the largest English army that had marched north in generations, drawing on feudal levies, mercenaries, and experienced soldiers from his Welsh and French campaigns. The English army that marched into Scotland in the summer of 1298 reportedly numbered over 15,000 men, including 3,000 heavy cavalry and 12,000 infantry, with a large contingent of Welsh longbowmen. This force dwarfed anything Wallace could field. Wallace attempted to use the same strategies that had worked at Stirling Bridge, avoiding pitched battle, using the terrain to his advantage, harassing the English supply lines, and wearing down the invaders through attrition. For weeks, the Scottish forces retreated northward, burning crops and supplies to deny them to the English army. Edward's forces suffered from hunger and disease as they marched through devastated countryside. There were moments when it seemed Wallace's strategy might work, that the English army might have to retreat simply because it couldn't feed itself. But Edward persisted, and on July 22, 1298, near the town of Falkirk, the armies finally met in open battle. Wallace had hoped to avoid exactly this situation, but his army was cornered and forced to fight. The Battle of Falkirk was everything Stirling Bridge was not. Where Stirling Bridge had been won through clever use of terrain and perfect timing, Falkirk was a brutal slugging match that exposed the fundamental weakness of Wallace's forces. They lacked the heavy cavalry and defensive armor to stand against a fully equipped English army on open ground. Wallace arranged his army in schiltrons, circular defensive formations of spearmen that could resist cavalry charges. These formations held initially, with English knights unable to break through the hedges of Scottish spears. But Edward had learned from Stirling Bridge. He used his Welsh longbowmen to pound the stationary Scottish formations with arrows. Medieval longbows could pierce mail armor at close range, and the massed volleys devastated the closely packed Scottish spearmen. When the schiltrons finally broke under the arrow storm, English cavalry charged in to complete the slaughter. The defeat at Falkirk shattered Wallace's position as guardian of Scotland. He resigned or was forced from power, replaced by Scottish nobles who believed they could negotiate better terms with Edward. Wallace himself disappeared from the historical record for several years, possibly traveling to France to seek support from the French king, Scotland's traditional ally. Some accounts place him in Norway or Rome, desperately seeking international support for Scotland's cause. What is certain is that he continued to be a wanted man, hunted by the English with a substantial price on his head. Edward never forgot Stirling Bridge or the humiliation of Cressingham's fate. He wanted Wallace captured alive, not for a quick execution, but for public punishment that would serve as a warning to any future rebels. The years between 1298 and 1305 saw Scotland's independence struggle continue under different leaders. Robert the Bruce and John Comyn, rival claimants to the Scottish throne, led the resistance, sometimes together and sometimes in competition with each other. There were victories and defeats, peace negotiations, and renewed warfare. Through all of this, William Wallace remained a fugitive and a symbol. His name was invoked by other rebel leaders, and songs and stories about Stirling Bridge kept alive the memory that English power could be challenged. But the reality was that Wallace, the common-born soldier, had been pushed aside by the great nobles who believed they, not a minor landowner, should lead Scotland. Wallace's capture in August 1305 near Glasgow was the result of betrayal. He was seized by men loyal to Sir John de Menteith, a Scottish knight who had made peace with the English. The circumstances of the capture are disputed. Some sources claim Wallace was betrayed during a meeting, others that he was caught by surprise at night. What followed was inevitable. Wallace was taken in chains to London, transported like a caged animal to be displayed before his enemies. Edward wanted Wallace alive, specifically so that he could be tried and executed publicly. The journey south must have been a nightmare for Wallace, knowing exactly what fate awaited him and having weeks to contemplate it as he was transported in captivity through hostile England. On August 23, 1305, William Wallace was brought to Westminster Hall in London for trial. The proceeding was a formality, a piece of theatre designed to give legal cover to what was essentially a political execution. Wallace was charged with treason against King Edward, with murder, arson, and various other crimes. The charge of treason was particularly cruel because Wallace had never sworn allegiance to Edward, so he could not legally be a traitor. When this was pointed out, Wallace reportedly replied that he could not be a traitor to a king he had never acknowledged. But the outcome was never in doubt. Wallace was convicted and sentenced to be hanged, drawn, and quartered, the most severe punishment in English law, reserved for traitors. The execution of William Wallace on August 23, 1305, was designed to be a public spectacle of state power. Wallace was stripped naked and dragged through the streets of London behind horses, pelted with filth and jeered at by crowds. He was taken to Smithfield, a traditional execution ground. The execution itself was a carefully choreographed horror. Wallace was hanged until nearly dead, but cut down while still alive. He was then castrated, disemboweled, and his entrails burned before his eyes while he was still conscious. Only then was he beheaded and his body cut into 4 quarters. His head was placed on a spike on London Bridge, displayed as a warning. His quartered body was sent to 4 Scottish cities, Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth, to be displayed as a warning to anyone else considering rebellion. Edward believed that Wallace's gruesome execution would end Scottish resistance by demonstrating the futility of challenging English power. He was wrong. Wallace's execution had the opposite effect. It transformed Wallace from a military leader into a martyr. The brutality of his death, rather than intimidating the Scots, enraged them and provided a rallying point for continued resistance. Within a year of Wallace's execution, Robert the Bruce had murdered his rival John Comyn, claimed the Scottish throne, and renewed the independence struggle. Bruce would fight for over 20 years, eventually winning Scotland's independence through the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328, long after Edward I's death. Bruce succeeded where Wallace failed, but he did so building on the foundation that Wallace had laid at Stirling Bridge. The story of what happened to Hugh Cressingham's skin took on legendary status in Scottish popular culture. Whether or not Wallace actually wore a belt made from Cressingham's skin, the story was repeated and believed because it fit perfectly with how the Scots wanted to remember both the hated treasurer and their heroic rebel. The tale served multiple purposes. It was a story of revenge against oppression, a demonstration that no English official was safe, and a visceral symbol of Scottish defiance. Later, Scottish chronicles and poems, particularly Blind Harry's epic The Wallace, written in the 1470s, emphasized and elaborated on the gruesome fate of Cressingham's body, using it to illustrate Wallace's determination and the justice of the Scottish cause. The long-term impact of Stirling Bridge extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. The battle demonstrated that Scottish forces, despite being outmatched in equipment and training, could defeat English armies through superior tactics and use of terrain. This lesson was not lost on future Scottish commanders. Robert the Bruce, when he renewed the independence struggle, used many of the same guerrilla tactics that Wallace had pioneered, avoiding pitched battles when possible, using the terrain, striking at vulnerable targets, and wearing down superior enemies through attrition. Bruce's greatest victory at Bannockburn in 1314, while different in detail from Stirling Bridge, followed similar principles of choosing favorable ground and using terrain to neutralize English advantages. Stirling Bridge also entered European military consciousness as an example of how determined infantry could defeat heavy cavalry under the right conditions. This was a crucial lesson at a time when mounted knights dominated medieval warfare. The battle was studied by military commanders and chroniclers throughout Europe. The idea that common soldiers, properly led and fighting on favorable ground, could defeat aristocratic cavalry challenged the entire social order of medieval society, where military prowess was supposed to be the exclusive preserve of the knightly class. The Swiss pike formations that would dominate later medieval battlefields, and the Flemish infantry victories against French knights at battles like Courtrai in 1302, all built on lessons that Stirling Bridge had demonstrated. The treatment of Cressingham's body also entered the medieval consciousness as an example of the brutality of warfare when conducted without the usual aristocratic conventions. Medieval warfare between Christian kingdoms usually followed certain rules. Nobles could expect to be ransomed rather than killed, bodies were treated with some respect, and there were limits on violence even in the midst of war. These conventions were honored more in theory than practice, but they represented an ideal. Wallace's treatment of Cressingham violated all these conventions, demonstrating that the Scottish rebellion was not conventional warfare, but a war of national survival, where no quarter would be given. This had profound implications for how the English conducted their subsequent campaigns in Scotland, leading to increased brutality on both sides. The historical evidence for the flaying of Cressingham and the use of his skin comes from multiple independent sources, both Scottish and English. English administrative documents refer to Cressingham's death and the abuse of his body. Scottish chronicles, while sometimes exaggerating details, consistently mention the flaying. Later English chroniclers, like the Lanercost Chronicle, also reference it. The consistency across sources suggests that something genuinely shocking happened to Cressingham's body, even if some specific details may have been embellished over time. Modern historians generally accept that Cressingham was flayed, though debate continues about exactly what was done with his skin and how much Wallace personally ordered versus what his soldiers did on their own initiative. The psychological impact of Cressingham's fate on English officials in Scotland was significant and documented in English records. After Stirling Bridge, English officials became noticeably more reluctant to serve in Scotland. Administrative correspondence shows increased demands for military escorts and fortified residences. Some officials requested reassignment or simply resigned their posts rather than serve in such a dangerous territory. This had practical consequences for Edward's ability to govern Scotland. If administrators were too frightened to collect taxes or enforce English law, then military victory alone couldn't secure Edward's control over the country. The flaying of Cressingham thus had strategic value beyond its immediate propaganda effect. It made English occupation of Scotland measurably more difficult by deterring civilian administrators. The question of Wallace's personal responsibility for what happened to Cressingham's body is complex. As battlefield commander, Wallace had authority over his troops and could have prevented the desecration if he chose. That he didn't suggests at minimum tacit approval. Some sources claim Wallace ordered it specifically, while others suggest it was done by his soldiers, with his knowledge but not his direct command. The distinction mattered less to contemporaries than it does to modern historians. Wallace was the leader of Scottish forces, and what his army did was attributed to him. By not stopping or punishing those who flayed Cressingham, Wallace accepted responsibility for the act. This was consistent with his overall approach to warfare. He fought without regard for conventional limits, using psychological warfare and terror tactics, because those were the weapons available to a force that couldn't match the English in conventional military power. The Battle of Stirling Bridge became central to Scottish national identity, a foundational myth of resistance against oppression. For centuries afterward, Scots told and retold the story of how Wallace defeated the English against overwhelming odds. The battle was commemorated in songs, poems, and later in novels and films. The National Wallace Monument, erected on Abbey Craig overlooking the battlefield in the 1860s, became a pilgrimage site for Scots and a symbol of national pride. The monument's construction during the Victorian era, centuries after the actual battle, demonstrates how Stirling Bridge continued to resonate in Scottish consciousness as a symbol of national independence and resistance to foreign domination. The brutality displayed at Stirling Bridge and in the treatment of Cressingham's body reflects the genuine desperation of the Scottish resistance. These were not professional soldiers playing by aristocratic rules of warfare. They were people fighting for their homes against an occupying power that had shown them no mercy. English policy in Scotland included mass executions of rebels, confiscation of property, and systematic destruction of resistance. In this context, the flaying of Cressingham, while shocking, was part of a larger pattern of total warfare where both sides escalated violence in response to each other. The Scots had watched their countrymen hanged, their castles destroyed, their lands confiscated. Cressingham's fate was revenge for all of this, and a warning that the occupation would not be cost-free. Modern archaeological investigations around Stirling have uncovered evidence supporting the chronicler's accounts of the battle's brutality. While few bodies have been recovered from the battlefield itself, likely because most were recovered and buried in the immediate aftermath, archaeological surveys have identified areas of disturbed ground consistent with mass burial sites. Examination of the riverbed has located armor fragments and weapons consistent with the period. These physical remnants, combined with the documentary evidence, paint a picture of a truly catastrophic English defeat that left the battlefield littered with corpses and military equipment. The scale of the disaster becomes clear when we consider that medieval armies rarely suffered total annihilation. A 5 or 10% casualty rate was usually enough to break an army and force retreat. At Stirling Bridge, the English forces on the north bank suffered casualties approaching 50% or more. The tactical innovation demonstrated by Wallace and de Moray at Stirling Bridge influenced military thinking for generations. Their use of terrain as a weapon, their patience in letting the enemy commit to a vulnerable position before attacking, and their focus on cutting off retreat routes became textbook examples of how a weaker force could defeat a stronger one. Military historians from the Renaissance onward studied Stirling Bridge as an example of excellent generalship. The battle demonstrated principles that remain relevant in military education: the importance of terrain, the value of patience and timing, the need to match tactics to available forces rather than trying to fight the way a stronger opponent wants to fight, and the psychological dimension of warfare. The story of Cressingham's skin entered popular culture and became the subject of various legends and embellishments. Later versions claimed the skin was made into multiple items: sword belts, scabbards, even saddle straps. Some versions had Wallace sending pieces to various Scottish towns as trophies. A particularly gruesome legend claimed a piece of skin was kept as a relic in Lanark, Wallace's hometown. Most of these elaborations cannot be verified historically, but they demonstrate how the story captured the popular imagination. The flaying became the ultimate symbol of Scottish revenge and English humiliation, a visceral image that communicated the intensity of the conflict in ways that simple battlefield victory could not. Wallace's brief period of power after Stirling Bridge showed both his strengths and limitations as a leader. He was a brilliant military commander, an inspiring war leader who could unite diverse groups behind a common cause. But he lacked the political skills and social connections to maintain power in medieval Scotland's complex feudal society. The nobility, who resented taking orders from a man of low birth, the competing claims of various Scottish factions, and the practical difficulties of governing a war-torn country, all proved beyond Wallace's ability to manage. His resignation after Falkirk suggests he recognized these limitations, stepping aside for leaders who might negotiate a political settlement. Yet this political failure doesn't diminish his military achievements or his symbolic importance. Sometimes history needs warriors more than diplomats. The English perspective on Stirling Bridge and its aftermath was one of profound shock and a desire for revenge that shaped policy towards Scotland for decades. To English chroniclers and officials, Wallace was not a freedom fighter, but a terrorist who violated the laws of civilized warfare. The flaying of Cressingham was held up as proof of Scottish barbarity and used to justify increasingly harsh measures against the Scottish resistance. Every English military campaign into Scotland after Stirling Bridge was conducted with enhanced brutality, with English forces explicitly ordered to devastate the country and punish the civilian population. This created a cycle of escalating violence. The more brutal the English became, the more desperate Scottish resistance grew, which in turn provoked even harsher English responses. Stirling Bridge wasn't the beginning of this cycle, but it marked a point where both sides abandoned any pretense of restraint. The medieval concept of honor and how it was violated at Stirling Bridge deserves consideration. Medieval warfare among Christian kingdoms was governed by an ideal of chivalry that, while frequently breached in practice, still established expectations of behavior. Knights were supposed to show mercy to defeated opponents of equal rank, to fight bravely but fairly, and to treat bodies with respect. These conventions didn't apply to common soldiers, who could expect no mercy, but they were supposed to protect nobles and officials. By flaying Cressingham, who was both a royal official and a clergyman, Wallace's forces violated multiple layers of medieval custom. This violation was intentional and strategic. Wallace was demonstrating that the Scottish resistance would not honor conventions that the English themselves had abandoned in their brutal occupation of Scotland. The question of whether Wallace's brutality at Stirling Bridge helped or hurt the Scottish cause is debated among historians. On one hand, the shock value of the victory and the fate of Cressingham inspired Scottish resistance and demonstrated English vulnerability. On the other hand, it hardened English determination to crush the rebellion and provided propaganda justification for brutal countermeasures. Edward I, who might have been willing to negotiate some form of limited Scottish autonomy, was enraged by Stirling Bridge and determined to completely subjugate Scotland. The treatment of Wallace himself, when he was finally captured, reflected this rage. His execution was deliberately made as brutal as possible, in part as revenge for what had happened to Cressingham. In this sense, the cycle of violence that Stirling Bridge exemplified ultimately harmed both sides, extending the conflict for decades. In conclusion, the Battle of Stirling Bridge and its brutal aftermath represent one of the most significant events in Scottish history. The military victory demonstrated that English occupation could be resisted successfully, providing a template for the campaigns that eventually won Scottish independence. The treatment of Hugh Cressingham's body, while shocking, was a calculated act of psychological warfare that sent a message about Scottish determination that resonated throughout Britain and Europe. William Wallace, through his victory at Stirling Bridge and his willingness to fight without regard for conventional limits, became a symbol of national resistance that transcended his actual historical achievements. The battle proved that sometimes the weak can defeat the strong through superior tactics, determination, and willingness to fight without restraint. The blood spilled at Stirling Bridge and the gruesome fate of Cressingham were the price of Scottish independence, proof that freedom is never granted by oppressors but must be taken by force, regardless of the cost. The legacy of Stirling Bridge extends to modern understanding of guerrilla warfare and resistance movements. Wallace's tactics, using terrain, avoiding enemy strengths, targeting vulnerable assets, maximizing psychological impact, are recognized as fundamental principles of asymmetric warfare. Modern military academies still study Stirling Bridge as an example of how a motivated force with inferior resources can defeat a conventionally superior enemy. The psychological warfare element, exemplified by the treatment of Cressingham, demonstrates how symbolic acts can have strategic value beyond immediate military effects. Wallace understood, perhaps intuitively, rather than through formal military education, that war is as much about will and morale as it is about weapons and numbers. By making an example of Cressingham, he attacked English morale while boosting Scottish confidence, achieving psychological effects that were as important as the tactical victory on the battlefield. The moral complexity of Stirling Bridge challenges simplistic historical narratives. Was Wallace a hero fighting for freedom, or a terrorist who used brutal tactics against civilized norms? The answer depends largely on perspective and the values one brings to historical judgment. From a Scottish nationalist perspective, Wallace was a hero who did what was necessary to free his country from oppression. From an English perspective, he was a rebel who violated the laws of civilized warfare. From a modern humanitarian perspective, both sides committed atrocities in a conflict where civilians suffered terribly. Perhaps the most honest assessment is that Wallace was a product of his time and circumstances, a medieval warrior fighting a brutal war using the weapons and tactics available to him. To judge him solely by modern ethical standards is anachronistic, but to completely excuse his actions because of historical context is to deny the humanity of his victims. History is complicated, and William Wallace exemplifies this complexity. The enduring fascination with William Wallace and Stirling Bridge reflects something fundamental about human nature and historical memory. We are drawn to stories of underdogs who overcome impossible odds, of heroes who stand alone against tyranny, of dramatic victories and gruesome revenge. Stirling Bridge provides all these elements in a narrative that has been told and retold for over 7 centuries. Each generation reinterprets the story according to its own values and concerns. Medieval Scots saw Wallace as a martyr for national independence. Victorian Scots saw him as a symbol of national pride during the height of the British Empire. Modern Scots, particularly during debates over Scottish independence from the United Kingdom, have invoked Wallace as a symbol of Scottish national identity. The historical Wallace has become a screen onto which each generation projects its own values and aspirations, ensuring that Stirling Bridge remains relevant long after the specific political conflicts that caused it have been resolved. The Battle of Stirling Bridge was far more brutal than popular imagination generally allows. The cinematic portrayals of the battle, while dramatic, often sanitize the reality of medieval combat and the treatment of the dead. The actual battle would have been a nightmare of mud, blood, screaming men and horses, the stench of open bowels, the sight of drowning soldiers weighed down by armor, and the sounds of butchery as wounded men were finished off with daggers and axes. The flaying of Cressingham wasn't quick or clean, but would have been a lengthy, skilled process of skinning a corpse in full view of survivors. The display of Cressingham's skin as trophy, and possibly its use as everyday items like a belt, represented a level of calculated desecration that goes beyond battlefield fury. This was revenge served cold, executed with deliberation days after the actual combat. Understanding this brutality doesn't diminish the significance of the Scottish victory. Rather, it reveals the desperation and determination of people fighting for their survival against what they saw as foreign tyranny. History tried to hide the full brutality of Stirling Bridge and its aftermath because such violence is uncomfortable for nations building official historical narratives. Both Scottish and English authorities in later centuries had reasons to downplay or reinterpret the most disturbing elements. Scottish nationalists wanted to celebrate Wallace as a noble hero, not as someone who ordered or permitted the flaying of enemies. English historians wanted to minimize a humiliating defeat and didn't want to dwell on the gruesome fate of English officials. As a result, the full story of what happened to Cressingham was often relegated to footnotes in popular histories or dismissed as exaggerated legend. Only by returning to contemporary chronicles and comparing multiple sources can we recover the reality that medieval people themselves recorded. That Stirling Bridge was won through brilliant tactics, but followed by vengeance that shocked even a society accustomed to violence. The truth of history is often more brutal, more complex, and more interesting than the simplified versions presented in popular culture and national myths.